if you guys like true crime, the paranormal, the mysterious, or a mixture of them all, you are in the right place. And as of now, I have a great story to tell you. To get it up to 72 likes, I will do an extra story this week in honor of your likeness. Also, let's not forget, please, if you are not subscribed, 80+% of you aren't, just hit that subscribe button right now. Do me a huge favor. But I know you want to hear the story, and I got that story. So without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. In the sleepy town of Pepperell, Massachusetts, kind of close to where I'm from, this insidious evil began to stir in the winter of 1986. And it crept into the lives of the Bowen family, masquerading as an otherworldly force before revealing itself as a horror that was all too familiar. And for sisters Tina and Karen Bowen, it started as an innocent attempt to contact their recently deceased mother. And of course, they just wanted to talk to their mother once again. So they decided to gather around this Ouija board one night, and the grieving girls hoped just to summon their mother's comforting presence. Despite not knowing everything that could happen with the Ouija board, they unwittingly opened a door to a malevolent entity that would terrorize them for months on end. So, back to the first night with the Ouija board, the sisters were startled awake by inexplicable noises echoing throughout the halls. Knocks and scratches and bumps reverberating throughout the darkness, filling their bedrooms with this very unsettling energy. And frightened but intrigued, Tina and Karen called out hesitantly, wondering if the strange sounds could indeed be their mother trying to communicate from beyond the grave. To their amazement and trepidation, the noises seemed to actually respond back to them, as if confirming this supernatural presence with knocking sounds and other things. But as the weeks ticked by, this apparent haunting intensified into a waking nightmare for the Bowen family. Because no longer just confined to the night, these odd sounds erupted through every room at all hours. A maddening amount of noise of knocks, thuds, and scrapes that defied all explanation. And stranger still, objects then began moving on their own accord. Beverages would just vanish from their cups. Furniture would just be shifted inexplicably. And the television would just cycle through channels even though nobody touched the remote. Despite being increasingly desperate and sleep deprived, Tina and Karen finally worked up the nerve to investigate this one shadowy evening. Armed with only this kitchen knife and a shared sense of dread, the girls went down to this dark basement, the epicenter of where all this bizarre activity was happening. So as they take their first couple steps down this creaky old basement, they notice right when they get down there with their flashlight beam revealing this unsettling sight, this cryptic message that was scrawled across the wall in this rusty red hue, and it said,
"I'm in your room. Come and find me."
Now, I have never been a little girl before, but I have been a little boy. And I'll tell you this, if that happened to me, I would be very scared. Oh, and if there's other crazy stories like this out there by the audience, please let me know in the comments below if anything creepy like this has ever happened to you. But to the rest of the story. Okay, so at this point, confused and terrified, the sisters finally went to their father, Frank, with this chilling evidence now. But the grieving widower could only just dismiss the unnatural events as figments of their daughter's imaginations, by products of their profound loss that they had. And I mean, who's to say different? That young, if you lose the most important person in your life, who's to say you're not going to see them around every corner and they're not going to be talking to you all the time? So he sent the girls to a counselor, wholly unaware that the all-too-real nightmare was beginning to unfold under his own roof. Because this sinister force that was lurking in the Bowen home was actually no restless spirit, but a flesh and blood predator of the most depraved kind. An individual who had been meticulously, quietly studying the family's every move, learning their habits and their fears, and calculating his reign of terror with meticulous precision. Then, on an unassuming December evening, the Bowens returned from an outing, and the first undeniable sign of this human intruder was found. And it was, believe it or not, of all things, an unflushed toilet. But evidence that someone had been lying in wait in their absence. So with rising panic at that moment, Frank commenced a quick search of his house, combing each room for signs of entry or disturbance. And it wasn't until he reached the threshold of his own bedroom when Frank froze in abject horror. Because there, crouched behind the back of the closet, was a wild-eyed figure of a disheveled man, holding a hatchet and a wrench in both of his trembling hands. Heart pounding at this point, Frank tried to get rid of the trespasser. In a valiant act of quick thinking, teenage girl Tina managed to bolt out from the house and alert the police. And by the time the officers finally arrived, they searched every inch of that property. And the armed intruder had vanished somehow without a trace, as if it were nothing more than a ghost or a spectral apparition. So baffled and unnerved, the authorities find no point of entry or exit, no sign that the mysterious figure had even been there at all. But only then, in the eerie afterglow of this close call, did the Bowens begin to absorb the full, sickening scope of the situation that they were in. Because the ghost that had been tormenting them for months was no supernatural entity, but a deeply disturbed human being who had been meticulously orchestrating their terror right from the shadows. Yes, a real-life monster who had not just violated the sanctity of their home, but had inhabited it like a malevolent parasite. So, shell-shocked and fearing for their safety, the Bowens temporarily relocated. Too shaken to remain another night in that house that now felt more like a crime scene than a place of shelter. But Frank, unwilling to let this unknown intruder claim dominion over the family home, bravely returned home just 2 days later to gather some of their belongings. And as he approached the front door, a flicker of movement was heard in the window, and it gave Frank pause. So he looked up, and the same wild, unhinged eyes from before were staring back at him, watching and waiting. His heart immediately went to his throat, and Frank dialed 911 and remained in his car, keeping a watchful vigil until a swarm of squad cars surrounded the property entirely. This time the police were determined to flush out the intruder once and for all. So officers armed with their guns drawn methodically cleared the house room by room, tracking down every hidden alcove and potential crawl space there was. And tensions were mounting as their exhaustive search came up empty again, until the shout came from the bathroom. And there, concealed by a panel in the wall, was a rough-hewn hiding place barely large enough for a body, a nightmarish enclosure of exposed pipes and wood. Yet, wedged inside this in contorted form was a young man, his face gaunt and his eyes devoid of any emotion at all. And it was none other than a 17-year-old person who was named Daniel LaPlante. The keeper of the Bowen's long torment emerged with an air of this vile satisfaction, as if he was proud to unveil his twisted handiwork at last. And the story that began to take shape in the aftermath of LaPlante's capture painted a portrait of a deeply broken psyche. But that's not all, because even though he was born into a turbulent home rife with abuse and neglect, Daniel's childhood was a waking nightmare of trauma, both physical and other types of assault at the hands of his father. And despite psychiatric intervention for a crippling hyperactivity disorder and antisocial tendencies, nothing could seem to counterbalance the corrosive effects from his upbringing. And just by the tender age of 15, LaPlante had already carved out a chilling niche as a prolific cat burglar of a particular pathology. You see, rather than steal from his victims, he derived this quick satisfaction, sadistic pleasure from silently violating their inner sanctums, rearranging these personal belongings and leaving these eerie hints of his intrusion to inflict this lasting psychological fear. He was a specter in the truest sense, disappearing without a trace and sowing the seeds of paranoia in his wake. And it was around this same time that LaPlante set his sights on the teenager Tina Bowen, orchestrating a manipulative plot to isolate the vulnerable, grieving girl. You see, posing as a charming, clean-cut peer, he lured her out onto a date, only to have his disheveled, unsettling true nature revealed. And Tina, though she was put off by it, endured the encounter out of a sense of compassion, unaware that her small kindness would trigger an obsession that was so dangerous. So consumed was LaPlante by his fixation on Tina and infiltrating the Bowen household that he effectively moved into their home, carving out a series of these hidden layers in the walls from which he could observe the family at every angle and carry out his clandestine torment, almost like a Norman Bates 2.0. And by the time of his discovery in December 1986, best estimates placed his secret residency at close to a year. A staggering violation of the family's privacy and well-being. But in the end, LaPlante's undoing proved to be his own mounting hubris. You see, these small mistakes in his elaborate charade allowed the authorities to piece together a stranger-than-fiction truth and apprehend him at last. And faced with the severity of his crimes, one might expect swift and decisive justice to have followed, right? But in a twist that speaks to the depths of LaPlante's cunningness, the disturbed young man cycled through the legal system with unsettling ease, released on bail to his family mere days after his violation of the Bowen's lives was made plain. And if the people of Pepperell thought the nightmare of Daniel LaPlante had concluded and came to an end, they would soon learn how devastatingly wrong they were. Because the brief taste of notoriety only fueled the flames of his psychosis, and he resumed his twisted hobby of stalking homes and families with reckless impunity, unspooling as a predator finally unleashed. And it was the unsuspecting Gustafson family that would become the ultimate recipients of LaPlante's pent-up depravity on the night of December 1st, 1987. In a crime that would rock the foundations of Pepperell and shatter any illusions of small-town safety, LaPlante lay in wait until Priscilla Gustafson and her two small children returned home to interrupt his demented plundering of their picturesque home. Now, I know some of you are squeamish with this stuff, so I'm not really gonna say what happens next. I'm gonna say it in a different kind of way. But in an act of remorseless brutality, LaPlante subjected Priscilla to the most intimate violation before coldly snuffing her out with a single bullet to the head. And then, I'm totally gonna ignore this point, but unfortunately, the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old, William and Abigail, were taken as well in horrible and vicious ways where you would wish to get 5 minutes alone with this guy in an empty room. So the savagery of the Gustafson murder snapped Pepperell out of its stupor, and the devastating proof that true evil not only lived among them, but had been allowed to fester unchecked in their midst. And for those who had been unaware of LaPlante's sordid history with the Bowens, the knowledge that his release had enabled this senseless slaughter of a young family was almost too much to bear. In the end, though, it was simple criminal sloppiness that brought LaPlante to justice for his heinous acts. You see, a trail of damning forensic evidence led authorities to the killer's doorway in just mere days, forcing him to flee into the Massachusetts wilderness in a futile bid to outrun his sins. But no mental illness or cunningness could save him from the crushing wheels of justice this time. LaPlante was found cowering in a roadside dumpster, right where he belonged, a pathetic, feral shadow of the boogeyman that he fancied himself to be. Okay, to preface this, the Nullarbor Plain is located on the Great Australian Bight in Western and South Australia. Now, the Nullarbor is a very flat and treeless area occupying a vast area of about 200,000 square kilometers. Now, the name actually comes from the Latin nullus arbor, which means no trees. And the local indigenous population also have a bleak name for the place as well, called Oandiri, which translates to waterless. And running through the Nullarbor Plain is the Eyre Highway, E-Y-R-E, I don't know how to say it. But this connects Western Australia to Southern Australia, and it is a long, remote road and the straightest in Australia. Now, from Norseman in Western Australia to Seduna in South Australia, a total distance of 1,664 kilometers, also known as 1,034 miles, the Eyre Highway is the only route that's available. And the Nullarbor has always been regarded as this mysterious and strange to those who have experienced the vast emptiness. And in 1988, it was the setting of one of Australia's most terrifying UFO encounters. So in January 1988, Faye Knowles relocated with her children from Adelaide to Perth, seeking new work and a fresh start in a different city. Now, her 3 adult sons, Patrick, age 24, Wayne, age 21, and Sean, who was only 18, decided to actually move in with her for her better job opportunities. So, along with their 2 pet little dogs in the car, they packed up and prepared to move. And they decided when they were going to travel that they would do it by car, and that meant it was going to be a lengthy trip ahead of them because the destination was over 2,700 kilometers through one of Australia's most isolated areas, including the Nullarbor Plain. However, the family wasn't worried, and while the trip would certainly be long and would take a few days, they were not worried at all because Faye had recently purchased a second-hand Ford Telstar that was in good working order, and they could all be, sharing the driving schedule as they went along. And the family was actually excited about their trip, considering, it a new adventure and a new chapter in their lives. Now, the Knowles family were 14 hours already into their vast trip when the first encounter of the UFO appeared at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, Sean was driving and they were about 40 kilometers west of Mondrabilla, I hope I said that right, which is near the West Australian border. Then all of a sudden, they saw this bright light that was just floating ahead of them right in the distance. And as they got closer with their car, they saw the bright light and it was swiftly moving towards the vehicle as well. They said it was about 1 meter wide, glowing bright and white with a yellow center. And the light was like an egg in a teacup. And then it disappeared after jumping around a bit. The light, though, became more aggressive and then moved and began hovering threateningly above the family sedan. And at this point, they were distracted and panicked by the blinding bright light that was directly above them. In fact, Sean actually had to swerve quickly after drifting into the next lane to avoid a collision on an upcoming passing vehicle. Now, after this dangerous close call, the light actually turned its attention to the other car that they nearly just hit, leaving the Knowleses alone. The strange light chased after the other car. And at this moment, the family were logically trying to explain what just happened to themselves. They had reason it must have been, just a trick of the light from the upcoming car. However, only a short time later, their unexpected traveling buddy would return. And this time there would be no passing traffic on this lonely, desolate road to distract it from the Knowles family car. So once the light soon returned above the car, in fact, directly above the car, but this time they heard this heavy kind of clunking noise. And it was as if something had landed on the roof, and the Knowles at that time believed it to be an alien spacecraft, and maybe now there's an alien actually on their roof. And unfortunately, the family had problems recalling the next sequence of events after the craft landed on their roof, making it uncontrollable and very heavy. In fact, Faye remembers actually winding down her window and touching her hand on the car's roof. And she recalls touching something that was warm, rubbery, and spongy before immediately retracting her hand, which now felt hot and covered in this black dust. And from Faye's own words, she said, "I wound down the window and I felt this thing on the roof. All this smoke stuff started coming into the car, and the car was covered in black stuff." That's an exact quote. Now, because this gray, black, foul-smelling mist invaded their car through the open window, the family then heard a peculiar, high-pitched noise that agitated the dogs. And we all know dogs kind of have this sixth sense, whether it's paranormal or whether it's about ghostly adventures. It seems like dogs can pick up a lot more than humans. And it was at that moment that the complete family suffered from the same disorientation. Now, try to really open up your mind and envision this. They claimed that their
voices lowered in pitch and slowed down,
with everyone sounding very far away, even though they were only meters away from each other. In a blind panic at this point, Sean hit on the gas and he hit it hard, and he accelerated the car to around speeds of over 110 miles per hour. But the Ford automobile was in fact no match for this strange outer-worldly craft. And soon the family was horrified to feel the car wheels leaving the road as they were lifted into the air. And then suddenly the next sensation that the Knowleses felt was the wheels making contact back with the asphalt. And there was a hard thud, followed by the sound of one of their sedan's tires bursting from the sharp impact. And at that very moment, the light disappeared, and the family was alone in the dark, and they were terrified. Now, they fled from the vehicle and decided to hide behind these low brushes off to the side of the road nearby. And in fact, it turned out that this actually was the right move, because shortly after, the light returned and briefly hovered over the now abandoned car. But at the same time, the Knowles found it practically strange that the craft seemed unable to find them outside of the vehicle and then disappeared. So at this point, they're all huddled together in the brush and they're worried and they're just thinking that this light is gonna come back again. But after waiting a little longer to ensure that they were all alone on the road, the family quickly changed their flat tire in record time, and the family then drove to the closest town called Sedona and pulled right into the town's police station, where they reported this encounter straight to the police. And you wouldn't believe it, because the news story broke the very next day. And the media coverage was extreme. UFO attacks family led the morning news and appeared in newspapers countrywide. The nation, in fact, was hooked on this story. I mean, after all, it had all the elements of an awesome horror movie. First, you got the isolated remote location. Then, there was also the terror of an actual physical encounter. But the worst and most exciting aspect was indeed the physical evidence. Yes, the police inspected the car after interviewing the Knowles' family, and they discovered damage to the vehicle's exterior, including dents on the roof, and this ash coating inside and outside of the vehicle. Now, the ash coating was later tested and determined to just be dirt from the plane, meaning that the car was just extremely dusty. But anyone who has driven through extreme dry and dusty areas can expect their car to become coated in this material. However, it was strange that the dust was also found inside the car, as even if the wind was blowing into the car via the open windows, it would be unlikely that the occupiers of the car would allow this amount to come in. I mean, why would they simply just not close the window? But the police also took their report very, very seriously, and the family did not appear to be making up such a strange story. Actually, on the contrary, the family seemed fearful for their lives and very sincere about what they were saying. So the police decided that the Knowles believed what they had saw, and that ruled out the possibility of a hoax. Also lending credibility to their story, the Knowleses were also just some of the people to report the sighting that night, because the drivers of another car and a truck also claimed to have spotted the strange light on the highway. However, they did not get a close look of it or experience anything similar to the Knowles family. But interestingly, that same night, some tuna fishermen were out about 50 kilometers at sea in the Great Australian Bight, and they claimed they were also buzzed by a bright light in the night sky and suffered from this similar voice distortion as the Knowles family. However, this encounter at sea appeared to be less aggressive. However, while certainly alarming them, they did not report the feelings of fear that the Knowles family did. In fact, the fishermen who reported the encounter had no way of knowing about the attack on the Knowles family, which occurred half an hour before that. So with all of this happening, the Royal Australian Air Force at Edinburgh, South Australia, was contacted and adamant that no aircraft in that region at that time was there to account for those sightings. And the Knowleses over the following weeks were interviewed by national media, and the interviews can be viewed all over the internet if you want to go and watch them now. In the end, the general public was divided between a logical explanation and, of course, the paranormal. However, most agreed that the family was truthful and generally appeared to believe that they experienced a devastating UFO encounter. But sometimes when you hear a story, it doesn't matter what he said or what they think, it matters what you think. So I want you to tell me right now in the comments, what exactly do you think happened? And if you want, like I said, go watch all the things surrounding it. Okay, so what you are in store for is the case of Maria Martin, and it became one of England's most talked about crimes. And it's not just murder that was involved. There were also tales of secret relationships, supernatural abilities, vengeful mobs, and an ominous curse that lingered over everything in the end. Maria Martin came into this world in 1801, born to a family of meager means. Her father, Thomas, worked as a mole catcher in a small village of Polstead in Suffolk, and relying on his skill at skinning moles and crafting their hides into gloves for their income. And sadly, after Maria's mother passed away, Thomas married a woman named Anne, a woman only slightly older than his daughter. So despite her humble beginnings, Maria was known for her stunning looks and her intelligence. And according to one story, a fortune teller predicted that she would have numerous admirers and wealth, but would not live to see old age. And as it turned out, 2 of those 3 prophecies came true. And Maria's love life began in her early 20s when she entered into a romantic relationship with Thomas Corder, the son of a prosperous farm owner. However, when Maria became pregnant, Thomas deserted her. But in no time at all, Maria found a new partner to replace Corder, a man by the name of Peter Matthews. Sadly, too, Maria's child with Corder passed away shortly after being born. But when Maria became pregnant once again, this time with Matthew's child, she learned that he also had no interest in taking on the responsibility of fatherhood or facing the inevitable gossip and judgment that came with having a child outside of marriage. But he promised to, provide financial support, but wanted nothing to do with their raising of the child or being involved in any of their lives. And as soon as Maria delivered her baby, she was introduced to Thomas Corder's younger brother, William. Now, William was known for his thievery and involvement in petty crimes. William had been sent off to London by his father with a small sum of money in hopes that he would find employment and turn over a new leaf. But William wasted the money on indulgent pleasures and turned to a life of illegal activities. But when his father and brother suddenly fell ill, he was forced to return to the farm and help his mother manage it. And unfortunately, William's father succumbed to tuberculosis, and his brothers were left permanently disabled by the disease. Then Thomas, William's eldest brother, who had a child with Maria, tragically passed away after falling through ice into a freezing lake. I mean, it seems like death just follows this person or family around. And soon after, William's other brother also died prematurely, leaving William head of the household and in charge of their family farm. And it was during this time that he began an illicit relationship with Maria. So naturally, Maria's parents were not supportive of her relationship with William, given his questionable reputation and the fact that his brother had abandoned her while she was pregnant with their child. So, as a result, William and Maria had to sneak around to see one another. And where they would sneak around to see each other was a well-known landmark in town called the Red Barn. And that became kind of their secret meeting spot. So after several encounters there, Maria discovered she was pregnant once again for the third time. But unlike his brother, William made a promise to marry Maria and take care of the family. And despite any doubts, Maria's circumstances demanded that she put her reservations aside. As a poor single mother in the early 19th century England, she had already brought great shame upon herself by having multiple children out of wedlock. And William, now from the inheritance of the farm, was a wealthy landowner and could potentially be her last chance at finding a husband who would not only marry her, but also provide for her and her family. So, in an effort to avoid gossip and the scrutiny of the town, William sent Maria away to Sudbury to give birth to their child. But tragically, once again, the baby passed away just 2 weeks later and was buried in secret to protect both of their reputations from the scandalous label of illegitimacy. And there were rumors that William may have played a role in the child's death, as he was not planning on marrying Maria despite the relationship. And after the tragedy, their relationship became more turbulent and they just constantly argued. And Maria at that time suspected that William was actually taking Peter Matthews' child support money. And although William claimed that he still wanted to marry her, he never made any concrete plans. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, William had a change of heart and suggested that they elope in Ipswich. He even told her that there was a warrant out for her arrest because she had illegitimate children. And it's uncertain if this was actually true or just a ploy to pressure Maria into a rushed marriage. And some accounts mention Maria disguising herself as a man to avoid arrest and meet William on their planned elopement night. Was this, the suggestion from William to ensure that no one could actually identify Maria? Okay, so the Red Barn was the last place Maria was seen alive. It was on that fateful day of May 18th, 1827, when William lured her there with the promises of love and a future together. But as the sun set and the darkness crept in, Maria's fate was sealed. William had carefully crafted a web of lies to deceive her family and the town. He claimed an issue with the marriage certificate, but little did they know it was all part of his twisted plan. And while Maria's family at the time frantically searched for answers, William fled town and embarked on a journey to cover his tracks. So he traveled to London and then ventured to the Isle of Wight, where he penned deceitful letters to Maria's family, claiming that they were finally married and living happily on the island. But the truth remained buried deep within the walls of that Red Barn, haunting those who dared to wonder what truly happened to Maria on that dark night. So William fumbled through a series of feeble and silly excuses, trying to explain why they hadn't had any letters directly from Maria. He insisted that she had been writing and was perplexed as to why her letters were not reaching the family and only his were. Then later on, he claimed that Maria had injured her hand, so she was unable to write to them, but reassured them that everything was fine between them and that they were happily married. So William returned to London and quickly began a new life for himself. In fact, he placed an advertisement in the Times seeking a wife, ultimately choosing Mary Moore, a school teacher, and believe it or not, there were over 100 responses to marry him. So him and Mary, they tied the knot in November 1827 and opened a girls' school in Ealing. But after Maria's disappearance, her stepmother started having these unsettling dreams about where she might be. She was having these visions, and the dreams seemed to hint that Maria had been murdered and buried beneath this red barn. Anne couldn't shake this feeling that these dreams were trying to tell her something, so she convinced her husband to search the barn. And as shocking as it was, he found a disturbed patch of earth exactly where Anne's dream had indicated. So standing there, armed with his mole-catching spike, he began to dig and eventually uncovered the body of his daughter. And she had been strangled with a green handkerchief, also shot in the face. Not to mention, it appeared to have been stabbed in her chest and neck, although these injuries could have been caused by her father's reckless digging. But there is a theory that suggests Maria's stepmother was having an affair with William, who was closer in age and appearance than her elderly husband. And some people speculated that Anne may have been aware of what happened to Maria and was waiting for William to come back so they could run away together. Crazy chess-type plan, right? But hell have no fury like a woman scorned, because when she learned that William had married someone else in London, she decided to seek revenge by revealing the truth about the murder. Oh, and it is worth noting that Anne's nightmares only began after William's marriage, which was about a year after Maria's death. Isn't it strange that the spirit world didn't start sending her dreams sooner? I mean, after everyone found out, the authorities were notified and immediately began searching for William, and they quickly located him at the schoolhouse with his wife. And despite months of messaging Maria's family and lying about her well-being, William claimed that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts when questioned by the police. However, a French passport was discovered in his possession, indicating that he may have been planning to flee the country. As soon as William Corder was arrested for Maria's murder, the media went into a literal frenzy. Journalists and reporters were convinced of his guilt and wasted no time in writing scandalous articles about the crime. And even before the trial began, William was portrayed as a cold-blooded killer. The public became fascinated with this case, and various forms of media, including books, songs, and plays, all depicted the gruesome details of the murder. Meanwhile, William sat in jail awaiting his trial. The infamous Red Barn where the murder took place became a popular tourist site, with pottery and souvenirs being made in its honor. Some people even scavenged pieces of the wood from the barn to sell as mementos, including toothpicks made from its remains. And in the same way, souvenir hunters relentlessly chipped away at Maria's grave, and by the time the trial began on August 7th, 1828, William had already been found guilty in the court of public opinion. And he even brought this up to Judge Alexander, who was presiding over the case, stating, "The all-powerful press, which shapes the opinions of so many individuals in this country and often unintentionally becomes a slanderer and destroyer of innocence, has depicted me as the most vile and repulsive of creatures. I have been portrayed by the media as a depraved monster beyond redemption." Despite William's words, this was all for a request for a change of location, but it was denied and the trial proceeded as planned. And he was facing multiple charges of murder, including stabbing, strangulation, shooting, and even live burial. However, due to the limited forensic technology in the 1800s, it was impossible to determine Maria's exact cause of death. And the court wanted to avoid any chance at all that William could be acquitted on a technicality, so they also charged him with other crimes such as fraud. And it was evident that they were determined to ensure that he faced the consequences for his actions. But did things go too far? You see, the trial was a highly anticipated event, with tickets being sold to those who wanted to witness the proceedings in person. And for those who couldn't get inside, they had to settle for waiting outside to hear the news of the day, and people from all over the country flocked to the town, causing hotels to quickly reach full capacity. Some individuals even resorted to sleeping outdoors, and according to one account, the streets were so crowded that it took officials half an hour just to make their way into the building through the throngs of the onlookers. Now, William's defense crumbled like a house of cards as he desperately tried to explain away Maria's death. But the gaping holes in his story only fueled suspicion and disgust. Why did he hide her death, lying to her family for months while she lay buried in the barn? Was this just all a twisted game or a calculated cover-up? So the evidence against him was overwhelming, but the jury's decision seemed almost predetermined by the frenzy of media coverage surrounding the case. And in just 35 minutes, they delivered a verdict. And that verdict was guilty. And Judge Alexander showed no mercy when he sentenced William to hang for his unforgivable crimes. And instead of being given a proper burial, his body was to be dissected and studied for medical purposes. And during the period leading up to his death, William was constantly harassed by court officials demanding a confession. And in the end, he admitted to causing Maria's death, but unintentionally. He said he had mistakenly shot her in the eye and then buried her in a panic. He maintained, though, that he did not stab her, although he did address the handkerchief that was found around her neck. But regardless of how she died, nothing excuses the fact that he pretended she was alive for months after her death. And 3 days after his conviction, William was publicly hanged with an audience of thousands. In fact, some reports even claim there was over 20,000 people watching. Now, for those of you with squeamish stomachs, this is where you might want to leave. His lifeless body just swung there for a whole hour before it was finally removed. And the executioner had carved this deep incision down his front, displaying his torso to the large crowd of onlookers. And his remains were thoroughly dissected, and his skeleton was repurposed as a tool for medical education. But the hangman saw an opportunity to profit from the macabre fascination surrounding the crime and sold pieces of the rope that were actually used in the hanging. Seeing this, others joined in and auctioned off items like locks of Maria's hair and fragments of the barn where the tragedy took place. And in some strange twist of events, William's scalp and one of his ears were obtained from the dissection and ended up being exhibited at a museum in London. But as a final gruesome act, William's skin was forcibly removed, used to bind a book that detailed his heinous crime. And this leather-bound book bore a permanent reminder of William's despicable deeds, creating an eternal connection between him and his victims. But even in death, William's spirit was not at rest. His ravaged body was put on display in the Hunterian Museum as a macabre attraction for the curious public. And with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that William's soul was not happy with how his remains were being treated. So Dr. John Kilner, an avid follower of the Red Barn murder, acquired William's skull through questionable means. And almost immediately, he began experiencing this string of misfortune, and also haunted by voices and plagued by visions of vengeful ghosts. And then one fateful night, as he lied in bed, a deafening noise shattered the stillness of the house. So he rushed downstairs, and Kilner found that the cabinet containing the cursed skull had been opened on its own accord, and the protective box had cracked open as well, and the skull itself had been thrown across the room. At this moment, terrified and certain that he had unleashed William's angry spirit upon himself, Kilner arranged for a proper Catholic burial for the skull in hopes of appeasing this restless soul. Yet, even after this final act of respect, strange occurrences continued to plague those who came in contact with any of William's remains. And it wasn't until 2004 when descendants of the Corridor family demanded that his body be removed from public display and cremated. And after years of fear and unease surrounding his presence, William could finally rest in peace, or so they thought.